Hello everybody, this is Gareth Cahoon Speaks back here with another video. I'd like you to hit the subscribe bar, give me a thumbs up if you like the video, or hit the notification bell to be notified when I post my next post. Or otherwise you can look me up on my ministry and the charities that I support at garethcahoon3@gmail.com on PayPal. This one here is about the events that happened in the European Parliament just back on the 17th of June. The European Parliament approved the new EU return regulation by 418 votes to 218. The legislation is intended to speed up the deportation of people who are in the EU without legal permission to stay, and allows, under certain conditions, the use of so-called return hubs, offshore facilities in non-EU countries for migrants who have received return decisions. After the vote, some right-wing and far-right MEPs, members of the European Parliament, celebrated by chanting "Send them back." Lawmakers from the centre left and left responded with chants of "Shame on you," creating a heated confrontation in the chamber. A few important points of context. The vote was about people who have been ordered to leave the EU, for example, rejected asylum applicants or others without legal status, not about all migrants generally. Supporters argue that the law will make returns more effective and discourage irregular migration. Critics, including human rights groups and some United Nations experts, argue that longer detention periods in offshore facilities could undermine migrants' rights and create risks of abuse. The offshore transfer provisions are subject to conditions, including agreements with third countries and requirements related to human rights and international law. The new return regulation is one of the biggest changes to EU migration policy since the 2015-16 migration crisis. Here's what it does and why it's controversial. The regulation applies to non-EU nationals who do not have a legal right to remain in the EU. For example, rejected asylum applicants or people who have overstayed visas. Its stated goal is to increase the number of actual deportations, which EU governments say remains low. Key measures include faster and more standardised return procedures across the EU, a new European return order making it easier for member states to recognise and enforce each other's return decisions, stronger obligations for people under return orders to cooperate with authorities, tougher consequences for those who refuse to cooperate or attempt to evade removal. What are return hubs? The most debated provision allows EU countries to establish or use return hubs in non-EU countries. These facilities could be used to hold people who have received return orders while arrangements are made for the return to their country of origin or another approved destination. Agreements would have to be made with third countries, and the regulation says they must respect international human rights standards and the principle of non-refoulement, not returning people to places where they face persecution. Unaccompanied minors are excluded. Supporters argue these hubs could make deportations more effective when countries of origin are reluctant to accept returnees. Critics fear they could become offshore detention systems with weaker oversight. The regulation was backed mainly by the centre-right European People's Party, Conservatives and various right-wing parties. Many governments that have been pushing for tougher migration controls. Supporters say the EU asylum system loses credibility if people whose claims are rejected are rarely removed. It was opposed by the Greens, of course, the lefties losing it, and the left-wing groups, many refugee and human rights organisations, and some United Nations and Council of Europe officials. Critics argue the law expands detention powers, risks sending people to countries with which they have little or no connection, could create offshore facilities with insufficient legal oversight, places too much emphasis on deterrence and deportation. Why was there shouting in the Parliament? After the final vote, some right wing MEPs celebrated by chanting variations of send them back, viewing the result as a victory for stricter migration enforcement. Opponents condemned the chant as dehumanising and responded angrily in the chamber. The scene reflected how politically divisive migration policy has become across Europe. How does this compare with the UK Rwanda plan? There are similarities, but they are not identical. The UK Rwanda plan intended to send asylum seekers to Rwanda for processing and possible settlement there, applied before asylum claims were fully resolved, based on a bilateral UK Rwanda agreement, ultimately cancelled after the UK government changed. EU return homes intended for people already subject to return orders applies after a person has been determined to have no right to remain, based on agreements between EU states and third countries, newly approved and moving towards implementation. The EU approach is therefore focused more on deportations and return enforcement than on offshore asylum processing. The broader significance is that migration policy in Europe has shifted noticeably towards stricter enforcement over the past decade, with centre-right parties increasingly adopting positions that were once associated mainly with the political right. To me, this is a good step forward for Europe, but not so good for the UK, because even though the UK could possibly still be in Europe because the Labour Party is looking to tie us back in, but when they're not getting into Europe and they know that they're going to have to stay in offshore facilities, guess where they'll come? The good old Great British Isles. And the Labour Party will welcome them all in, whether they're rapists or not. Shalom, Maranatha, and Hallelujah.